Hello and welcome to my in-depth dodge and burning tutorial where I'll explain to you what dodge and burning is, how you can use it in your own pictures to create dynamic, interest and differentiation in the lighting, which kind of pictures it works best in, and at the end I'm even going to show you how you can add dodge and burning to your pictures in Lightroom, and I'm going to give you all of my tips, techniques, settings and ways to do that to get a more interesting, more professional looking and just a much more dynamic picture at the end. If you would like to skip ahead, then you can just do so by going to this time mark right here, and from there on I will start editing the picture and adding dodge and burning and showing you how to do it. But first of all, I would actually like to talk about what dodge and burning is. So what dodge and burning essentially is just making individual parts of your picture either darker or brighter. And this comes from the old film days. It has been used way before digital, and what you want to use this for is to complexify your lighting scheme in your picture and essentially making it more interesting and more dynamic. So for example, if I show you this picture before any dodge and burning and afterwards, you can see there's quite a big difference in terms of dynamic and interest. And even though the general colors and the contrast and the general look of the picture stays the same, it just looks a little bit more interesting and dynamic. And if I go to this picture right here, you can see as well from before any dodge and burning and here is after, it is really quite a severe difference and it makes your picture look a lot more interesting in a subtle way. So now that you know what dodge and burning is and kind of know what it does to your picture, let's go over which kind of pictures you can use it in. And the easy answer is in almost all of them. So in my personal pictures, I think I've added dodge and burning about 95% of the time. And whether it be landscape or nature, cityscape, even portrait or wildlife, whether it be in black and white or in color or during sunset, it doesn't really matter. In pretty much all pictures you can utilize and benefit from dodge and burning. However, at the end there are definite pictures that dodge and burning will have a much bigger effect on than others, and in my personal experience, I think that landscape pictures as well as cityscapes or nature photos have a little bit more of an effect or more possibility for dodge and burning than, let's say, portraits or wildlife pictures. And also, pictures that have a very even and almost flat lighting scheme are ideal for dodge and burning. So sunset photos, night shots, and even overcast pictures are really ideal, because there you can really go crazy with the dodge and burning and have so much more impact on it rather than, let's say, as a picture that was shot at midday that already has a lot of differentiation within the lighting and a lot of shadows and highlights. But even in those kind of pictures you can still benefit from dodge and burning. Alright, so now that we have these questions out of the way, let's actually go to a picture, actually this photo right here, and add dodge and burning on it while explaining to you what I look for, what kind of works, what doesn't, which kind of settings I use, and also how I do it in general in Lightroom. And I think that I want to mention real quick, as you've seen before, dodge and burning is not really a thing that you can just copy and paste from picture to picture. It's really something that is very individual and very dependent on the actual picture, and it is something that you want to do from scratch with every single photo separately. So let's go into this picture right here, and I've actually edited this picture kind of almost final, so that the only thing that is missing is dodge and burning. And as you can see, this was shot kind of after sunset, or so there's still a little bit of color in the sky. But what I really love about this photo is that we have all of these lanterns and all of this light and all of these shadows. So there's really going to be a lot of opportunity for dodge and burning and showing you kind of what to look for when doing it within your pictures. Alright, so let's get actually started, and for dodge and burning, I would always suggest you to zoom into the picture. Usually I like to go to about a 1:2 aspect ratio, so it doesn't have to be too crazily zoomed in, but you do want to have a little bit more of a detailed view of the whole picture and your lighting. So then, before you do anything else, a good idea is just to look at your picture, look at the lighting scheme, and see where is the light coming from, where could you enhance that, and where could you perhaps go over the shadows or the boring and dull parts, and kind of add some interest there. And this is a thing that you probably will not be able to do if that's the first time you try dodge and burning, because it is really something that comes with experience. Once you've added dodge and burning in a few dozen pictures, you will start to kind of get the idea of what to look for and where it will work. Alright, so then let's actually go to how you can add it. And within Lightroom, there are pretty much two ways that you can do it, either with the rail filter or with the adjustment brush. And it's really up to your preference, although I definitely prefer the rail filter, and that is just because it has a much softer edge. If I add a filter right here, as you can see here with the feather to 100, if I go like crazy into the plus exposure, you see it's a super soft edge and it looks very, very organic wherever I put it. And you couldn't really get the same amount of edge and a soft edge, which is called feather, in, for example, the adjustment brush. It's just not the same, and I really like the rail filter for that. Also, another advantage of the rail filter is that you can just add one over a certain part of your picture, then right-click duplicate, drag it to another area, so that way you can add a lot of filters relatively quick. But also you can then adjust all of these sliders right here, and it will be independent of the previous filters. So for example, with the adjustment brush, if you would add an adjustment brush right here and another stroke right there, it would be the same. And if I would, for example, change the sliders right here, it would affect both, so then you kind of have to go into a new one every single time, and I just don't think it's really that great of an option if you already have the possibility of just using the rail filters. Alright, so as I said, it's definitely up to you what you want to use, but I'm gonna show you the whole process with the rail filters. Alright, so now that we have our rail filters and we're here, let's just reset everything for now. And the first thing that you want to make sure that you have in every single rail filter is set the feather to 100. If I show you the example here, as you can see, it gives you a very soft and organic edge, and as I bring that down, it becomes more and more harsh until eventually you just have a very, very harsh filter, basically without any edge at all. And of course, it's pretty obvious right here that this looks completely unnatural and unorganic. So always want to make sure that you have your feather at 100. And then the other thing that you want to look for is that you invert the mask, because otherwise everything outside of the rail filter will get affected by these adjustments. Okay, so after you've done that, the next thing that you want to decide on is whether you first want to add plus exposure or minus exposure. And I just personally like to add plus exposure because it tends to have a little bit of a bigger impact than the minus one, but if you would like to start off with the minus, you can definitely do that as well. So then, let's say we want to start off here with the plus exposure. The next thing is choosing your sliders, and this is just a very, very rough starting point that you want to change on different filters and different areas within your picture, but it is still a good idea to kind of get a starting point. And of course here I also want to explain what all of these sliders do. And for the plus exposure, you pretty much have 4 sliders that you want to use very frequently. So the first one is just exposure. So for example, if I bring up the exposure right here, you can see it gets brighter within the filter. And exposure does a pretty even job. It adds exposure over a very even area, very evenly. and it's definitely a great starting base and probably the most important slider for the plus exposure. But also you have the highlight slider right here, and you can either bring that up or down. Now this is a thing that I don't use too much, but it is still useful in some cases. And for example, let's say you would want to have this part a little bit brighter, but you would still not want these lamps to be just, super bright. Then you could, for example, go into the minus highlights and it will kind of fix that. And of course, if you still want the lamps to be especially bright, but not necessarily the background being affected with it, then you could also go into the plus highlights even more. But generally speaking, highlight slider is the least important of all of these four. Then the next thing that you have is the white slider. And the white slider is very, very important, and I always mix them within the plus exposure. And what this will do is kind of add exposure in a more selective way. So for example here, as you can see, if I bring up the exposure, once again it adds in a very even and a very distributed way. But when I add plus whites, it does it in a very different way. It makes kind of the bright parts a little bit brighter, but in a more broad way than the highlight slider. So this is a great way to make your whole dark burning seem a little bit more natural. So for example, if as a starting base, I would probably go into the plus exposure first, then mix that with a little bit of plus white, and then I can lastly go into the color. But once again, white is very, very important. It has kind of an interesting effect that is maybe a little bit hard to explain, but the easiest thing is to try it out for yourself. And it's almost a subtle thing, but it is very important and it can really change the look of your dark burning. So if you're just new, I would always suggest you to mix plus exposure with whites, and generally leave out the highlight slider unless you have a particular use for it. For example, if you want to make this area brighter but at the same time not really affect the lamps by that much. Alright, so now that we've covered all of these three sliders, the next and last major thing for the plus exposure dark burning is color. And especially within sunset pictures or when it's overcast, or for example this night shot right here, you can see the color. I really like it, it's very soft and subtle, but at the same time it might be just a little bit dull, a little bit flat, and it could use some differentiation, and especially warmth. So this is a thing where you want to just go to color and click on this little thing, and then you will get this palette right here, from where you can choose all sorts of different colors and all sorts of different saturations. And here I would really suggest you to go in some sort of yellowish tone, so you can fine tune that whether you want a more traditional yellow or maybe a little bit into the orange tones. But I would not suggest you to really go into the reds or into the purples or anything like that in general, because of course by making it warmer with the orange and the yellows, so it will look more natural, as if, for example, this lantern would have spilled right here, as you can see from after adding quite a lot of saturation within the oranges here to before. It really works a lot better, and also of course orange will look a lot more natural than, for example, if you would want to add green or red lighting to your dark burning. So I would always suggest you to go a little bit into the orange to yellow tones. How much saturation, it really depends on the picture and your liking of course, but here I think even 100 works right now. Most of the times it's usually around 20 to 30, but I really like the look right here. So then after you have your kind of general settings, you can start adding dark burning. And what I'm actually gonna do here is just add dark burning to these lanterns right here, and then afterwards to the other parts. And the great thing about lanterns and lights, especially if you have kind of a darkish picture like this, that was perhaps shot at sunset or at night, is that you can really exaggerate that whole lighting and make it look as if it spilled a lot more than it actually did. So for example, what I'm gonna do here is just perhaps maybe go a little bit down into the saturation with the yellows right here, and just add a filter like this over the lantern and fine adjust all of these adjustment sliders right here. And let's just fine adjust that, and then we can just right click, duplicate, and we'll get a duplicated filter of that we've added previously over the top of that one, and then we can just grab it and drag it over another part. So I'm gonna do that with all of these lanterns right here. Once again, right click, duplicate, add one right here, and of course adjust the sizes. And maybe even later on gonna fine adjust the sliders with each and every respective filter so it really fits the lantern itself perfectly. But for now, I think the most important thing is just to add this filter over all of the lanterns. And here, want to make it bigger as the lanterns get bigger as well. Right click, duplicate, add another one on the foreground right here. Make this one even bigger than the previous one. And I think I forgot this one right there, so let's add another one. And once again, just make it a little bit smaller for the background. So now what I have is a filter plus exposure filter with all of these adjustments over, or rather under, every single of these lanterns. And if I show you right away without any fine-tuning from before to after, you see it's quite a bit more interesting and more complex in terms of the lighting scheme. So it's already kind of a good starting point, but now you just want to go over your picture and over your filters and just kind of fine-tune them in terms of size, positioning, and also want to make sure that of course everything looks natural. So for example, here maybe go a little bit back with the whites, maybe the same with this one right there. Then let's see on the right side, I think that looks pretty good. Maybe this one not quite as much exposure. And this is also a very important thing, that you don't just add something like this, you know. This makes the picture look completely fake, and it's not what we want here. What we want here is really just to add exposure and whites and all of that stuff in a very reasonable way, so that it really just enhances what is already there rather than completely blowing your picture. The general idea is always kind of, you don't want your viewer to really notice that you've added any dodge and burning. You want to do it in such a subtle way that it really just affects your picture in a positive way without really being able to notice it. So alright, I think this looks pretty good for the start, but now what I'm actually gonna do is just duplicate this filter right here, and then resize this one and just kind of look, perhaps not go quite as much into the color and whites and everything with these kind of filters. Also go a little bit down into the exposure, and then just make sure that all of this spill looks natural, because of course here what we want to do is make it seem as if the light from the lanterns would have spilled a lot more on the actual elements right here, and we want to do this in a natural way. So that's why I'm adding all of these filters, to really at the end make it look natural and not fake, because once again, this is the whole idea, just to add dynamic and interest in a natural way. So once again, just right click, duplicate, bring it over to another area. And by the way, you could also press down your front slash key if you would like to duplicate the filter, but I think just right click and duplicate works pretty good for me. So then maybe make this a little bit brighter, and once again, just want to make sure that it looks natural, so it doesn't look like we've added anything weird, so really just as if the light would have already been there. And I think that does a pretty good job. So let's zoom out again and see what we've done on just these lanterns. Here is from before and here is after, and I think it did a pretty good job. I really like the look of it. I think it ended up looking very natural, and if I mean, you see it from here, but if I zoom in, you see it even better. It looks so much more interesting if I show you the difference from before any of that to after. And keep in mind, this is just for the lanterns, we're just getting started, there's a lot more dodge and burning to be done. So another thing that you could do is of course enhance any other light sources. For example, what we have here is this train with the 2 headlights, so why not just enhance this as well? So I'm gonna grab another rail filter right here and just kind of make it relatively long, and the idea here is just to angle it and make it look as if that light would have spilled some light on the actual trails. And of course, once again, adjust all of the color, add a little bit of warm tones, also add some whites in the mix, and fine tune the exposure as well, of course. And always want to make sure that you angle it properly, that you make it look natural. And then I'm even gonna duplicate it and of course drag it over to the other one as well. And here, maybe not quite as far into the exposure. And I think that actually looks pretty good. So let's quickly see, once again, if I disable any rail filters from before to after. It's just a lot more interesting, and I really think it works in this case. Then let's see if there are any other lights that I might want to enhance. For example, here we have this kind of bike parking, whatever, and with some lights on top. So let's make this a little bit brighter as well. And here, because these lights aren't really that, distinctive as these lanterns, you might just want to add kind of a big one over the whole area and make it look more interesting and more bright there. That way, so let's do that right here. Also add a little bit of yellows, and I know this is a very slow process and it's gonna take you a while to add some dodge and burning if you really want to do it in the best possible way, but at the same time I'm doing this for the video, so I really try to go super slow and super in depth and explain everything. And let's add another one right here where there's also some light. And I think that looks pretty good in terms of the lighting. And maybe another 2 right there where this kind of train station, if you want to call it, is. And also enhance that a little bit, although not that much. And yeah, once again, I really want to explain everything very in depth, so you can actually see what I do and see my technique. If I would edit this for myself, then I would go a lot quicker, and I would generally say that about 5 to 10 minutes is what you should expect to use within dodge and burning in your picture. But of course, if you want to do it a lot faster and just kind of do a very rough dodge and burning, then you can do that in just 1 or 2 minutes. But let's just quickly see. So once again, first of all, I've just enhanced all of this lighting that was already there and made it look as if some light would have spilled on the foreground way more than it actually had on these lanterns right here. So let me show you from before any dodge and burning right now and afterwards. It's already a little bit of a difference and I really like it, but there's definitely a lot more to be done as well. So then, let's just see where else I want to add dodge and burning, and I think right here, for example, this tower is a great idea. Once again, want to mix these with color, with whites, as well as exposure. And you really want to adjust all of these filters individually and see how much does it need in certain areas. And then the great thing, you can just right click, duplicate, drag it over another area. And for example, this house is a great example right here. This is pretty flat, so just adding a little bit of plus exposure, a little bit of plus exposure rail filter, it can really help to get some differentiation and some interest back there in this house. And as always, just adjust these sliders. And by the way, you can even go a little bit into the warm tones if that's still not enough warmth here from the color. And I'm once again going to show you from before any dodge and burning, and just look at this area right now. So from before to after, it really looks so much more interesting. And once again, you could fine tune that really crazily and make it look just how you want it. But I'm going to try to mainly focus on the actual effect and showing you what it does and how to use it rather than really fine-tuning every single pixel of it. So let's add another one over here. Right click duplicate and go a little bit faster and just add some differentiation over all of these pretty dark and a little bit dull areas, a bit more into the warmth right here as well. Right click and duplicate, then maybe add a bit of a smaller one right there. And let's see until Lightroom loads. I hope this doesn't lag for you, because this is a very hardware intensive task with moving around all of these filters, especially with recording it of course, but I think it should be fine. So right click duplicate and let's add a little bit on this fencing as well. There are really so many possibilities, once again, especially because this has a relatively simple and maybe even a little bit of a flat lighting scheme. Previously, you can really do so much to it, and I'm gonna do this a lot. I'm gonna turn off dodge and burning and just look at this part right here. It looks so much more interesting and alive and vibrant, and at the same time it still has some differentiation from the dark tones to the shadows. So dodge and burning, such a valuable tool, and there's so much you can do with it. So let's add another one right here, make this a little bit dark, or a little bit, a little bit bigger. Then right click duplicate, bring it over this area as well, just see how it looks, and maybe not quite as much into the color. It's really all about complexification and differentiation while not going overboard and, still keeping it looking natural. So once again, don't want to add anything like that because that will just blow your picture like crazy. Then let's go over here to the bushes, and even though these bushes, they're not really as an essential part of the picture, they're not where your attention should go, but they're still a little bit dull, and I think I could make them a bit more interesting. That really helps for the overall look and mood of the picture. So here I think I'm gonna go especially into the plus white, so the kind of whitish parts in these bushes get affected even more by the dodge and burning. And I'm gonna right click duplicate, bring one more over here and make it not quite as big, because of course you want to make it still be a local adjustment, so you don't want to just add huge filters like this, generally speaking, but rather multiple small ones to really have a nice sense of differentiation and a sense of different exposure within your photo. So let's add another one right here. There's really not that much to dodge and burning. The most part is definitely to learn where it works and how much works. And that is really something that you're gonna get with experience and just adding dodge and burning to your own pictures and trying it out. So it's not really something that I can explain you too well. But for example, here we have kind of the same situation as we had in the bushes over there. Just a little bit boring, so maybe make it a little bit more interesting. Right click duplicate, add another one right here. And it really doesn't have to be a lot every single time. It can be really just a hint of exposure, and that already helps. And of course, once again, can't say it enough, you don't want to go overboard. You always want to make sure that it still looks natural. So here, another one, really just a small one. Then right click and duplicate, and let's go over this house right here. Make just maybe, make this a little bit longer, angle it. So just this side of the house looks a little bit more interesting. Maybe mix that with a little bit of warm as well, and just see how it looks, and then fine adjust it. Maybe a little bit more exposure as well as whites on this area. And then right click duplicate. Maybe just make a little bit of this dark side a bit brighter. And especially with dark parts, you generally don't want to add any plus exposure because you still want the differentiation. And if I would just add a ton, of course, it will look terrible. But sometimes if you even go over the dark parts and you just add a little bit, it can actually work in your favor and still add a little bit of differentiation while not making it look unnatural. but I think maybe another one over here actually, with quite a lot of warm tones. So then right click duplicate, and I know this is very long and much longer than I would ever do with any of my other tutorials, but I think it is really valuable to show you that even some small areas right here that maybe not have a lot of exposure already or may not be as obvious as for example the lanterns right here, can still at the end benefit from the dodge and burning. And let's add a little bit more exposure right here, and right click and duplicate it. And if you're new to dodge and burning, it can be just a good idea to right click and duplicate and, you know, just drag these sliders around the whole picture, because if you're new, there are gonna be some spots that you might not have even thought about that dodge and burning could work in, but you just discover it by dragging it over and kind of, you know, learning by trial and error that way. So once again, this is not really a thing that I can explain perfectly and just say put a dodge and burning filter there, there, and there, and you will have a great picture. Because of course every single picture is super different with the lighting scheme and where it will work, where it doesn't work. And also your personal preference is very important on deciding how much you want to add. For example, this might already be a little bit too much for you, so you can of course also adjust that. And by the way, you can also add smaller rail filters over bigger ones, and that way you even have some differentiation within certain parts. This is really advanced and is once again something that you're gonna find out by just trying it out. So let's add another one right here, and here I really don't want to add too much exposure, maybe just a little bit of white, and the main thing that I want to do here is complexify the color. And let's see here, I think it's nearing the end in terms of the plus exposure dodge and burning, because this picture, you know, even though there are still quite a lot of areas, I think I've covered the most important ones, and I think it actually looks pretty good. So let's see a final time, especially up here. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. By the way, you could even add dodge and burning in the sky. So for example, you could right click duplicate and maybe add a little bit of dodge and burning in this area right here. Now of course this is way over the top, but let's say something like this, you know, it works a lot better and it's still not over the top. So dodge and burning is such an amazing tool, such an amazing way of complexifying your lighting scheme, but I think this is pretty much the most important things explained and the most important areas covered. I'm just gonna focus on the foreground right here and not so much on the sky, because if you want to add differentiation within the sky, there are even some methods with colors and all of that. And I could even make a specific video on how to add differentiation and interest in terms of color within the sky of sunset pictures. If you really want to, just leave me a comment down below. But once again, this is really about the dodge and burning within the foreground and just showing you the differentiation. So for example here, maybe just add another one over the bench with a little bit more of this orange color right there. And I think that actually looks pretty good. Maybe not quite as much of saturation. And you see, depending from filter to filter, it's really different from the settings. I mean, the settings are always kind of the same, but the amount is different, because you really have to adjust that in order not to have an overdone, or for that matter, even underdone picture at the end. So let me finish up here, and I really don't think there's too much to be done other than that, especially in terms of the plus exposure. And as you can see, I've added quite a lot of plus exposure rail filters. This is not necessarily something that you can do with every single picture. This is really just a very good example with all of these structures and these houses and stuff like that. Depending on the picture itself, you might just want to add 5 rail filters, and that will already do the job as good as it can. But anyways, let's see here before any plus exposure rail filters, and here is after. Huge difference. I mean, It is a very subtle difference for one, so subtle in terms of doesn't completely blow or change your picture and make it look unnatural, which is a good thing, but it is a huge change in terms of the subtle differences in the lighting. And I don't know about you, but I like this picture so much more. It looks so much more refined and interesting, so much more going on there rather than before, where it really is, in terms of the color, a little bit dull, and especially in the lighting. Even if you just look at this bridge part right there, it becomes so much more interesting, so much more dynamic, and I absolutely love the look. Alright, so then after adding all of this plus exposure, darken burning, all of these rail filters, another thing that you can do, and that I would actually suggest you to do, is to add minus exposure, darken burning, and this is definitely not as important as the plus exposure, and it will also not have quite as big of an impact, but it is still at least worth to play around with, and since this is a super in-depth darken burning tutorial, I might as well just show you. And with the minus exposure, wanna keep the feather at 100, invert the mask, but this time of course going into the minus exposure, and you can also go into the minus blacks. Blacks is kind of an equivalent as whites, so it really makes kind of the dark parts a little bit darker, and you could even play around with the shadows and bring them down, although shadows I don't use too many of the times. And other than the plus exposure rail filters, I would not suggest you to add any color, because of course naturally the color comes from the highlights, the sun, the lanterns for that matter, so it will really not look that natural if you would add any color within the blacks. So then let's see here, I think I'm gonna start off once again with a little bit of minus exposure, then also bring some blacks into that mix, really just a hint here. And the reason you want to add minus exposure, darken burning, is to add differentiation from the different plus exposure sides, and also to make already previous dark shadows even darker. And that way you will create interest and even more differentiation and contrast for the most part. So for example here, this bush, you know, from before, if I show you the bush before, it doesn't look bad at all, but it just works a little bit better if a little part of this bush is darker than the other ones. And once again, I didn't even add any plus exposure, darken burning there. It's really just, you know, an addition to make the darks even darker. And if you just look at this bush right here, now we really have some nice differentiation from very dark blacks going to the medium blacks, going into the kind of dull neutral area right here, going into the highlights, and that way you really have so much differentiation just within one bush. Let's grab another one right here and see where it works. For example, back in the, or under this bridge right there, maybe just a small area with a little bit of minus exposure could work here. And once again, it's all about a very specific kind of contrast, a specific kind of differentiation, and the effect and the impact will not be anywhere near as dramatic or amazing as the plus exposure, but it is still worth to play around with in my opinion. And by the way, especially if you have black and white pictures, this minus exposure, darken burning can really have a much bigger impact than in this picture right here, because this is a sunset with a lot of light, so it is not necessarily a super contrasty or stormy kind of look at the start anyways, so there are just some limited possibilities for minus exposure, darken burning. But once again, going in between these two plus exposure, darken burning filters and just making them a little bit darker. And it doesn't matter if it overlaps a little bit, but once again, the filter is always going to look a lot bigger. If you're going to have the feather to 100, the feather will really be very soft, and the actual effect will rather be in the middle right here. So right click, duplicate this one as well. And let's see, maybe there's a last spot for minus exposure, darken burning. Maybe just on this side of the house, so we have the right side a little bit darker than the left. So once again, it's all about differentiation, complexification, and making your whole picture and especially, of course, lighting scheme more interesting. So I think that was it in terms of minus exposure, dodge, and burning. I mean, it's very clear here that I've added nowhere near as many as the plus exposure ones, and that it also didn't have as much of an impact as the plus exposure ones. But if I show you before any dodge and burning that is with plus as well as minus exposure, it's a really big difference. Once again, there are pictures where you can do that even more. There are pictures where you can add not quite as much dodge and burning, but especially if you have a soft lighting scheme with an overcast sky or a night picture or a sunset picture, you're really gonna have a lot of opportunity for dodge and burning. And I think especially in the previous examples right there, I'm actually just gonna show you a few more examples of dodge and burning from some other pictures that I've edited. You can see it really depends on the picture, and some have more, some less impact, of course, but it is really a huge difference, and I think dodge and burning is one of the most important adjustments to add to your picture. Maybe it seemed a little bit difficult or weird at first, but I hope now with the whole editing and explaining what I look for and also showing you the different techniques to do in Lightroom, as well as showing you all of these examples right now, as well as at the very start, from the all kind of different pictures from before and after any dodge and burning. I hope you have a much better understanding of it and that you really see what it does, as well as, of course, how to use it in your own editing. And if you did so, then please leave me a thumbs up. It really helps me to see which kind of videos I should do in the future. And if you guys like these kind of videos, by the way, if you really like these dodge and burning tutorials, then I might even make another one with some other pictures in the future. And then, of course, not go as in-depth as in explaining the whole dodge and burning process, but rather just showing you the whole process of adding dodge and burning on a picture and explaining what I look for, why I drag it over there, and so on. And also, of course, you can subscribe if you would like to see more videos like this one and stuff, and if you really liked it, you can also share it. But I don't want to sell out too much right here. I already stole enough of your time, and I'm just gonna sign out. But on a serious note, thank you very much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Hopefully you'll have some success with your dodge and burning, and hopefully I'll see you in the next episode.